Welcome to The Green Fix, the climate and sustainability podcast for Australian businesses navigating this new commercial landscape. 2 weeks ago, we spoke with Rade Musulin, principal at actuarial firm Finity Consulting, about the new Trump presidency, the LA fires, the new Australian sustainability reporting standards, and the role actuaries play in helping organisations evaluate their climate risk exposure.
It begins with the board, senior management, and leadership of the organization to educate themselves on not only the letter of the law and the requirements that are in the standards, but also the economic changes that are likely to occur. What does a 1.5 degree world look like? What's going to happen with physical risk, etc.
In today's episode, I'm your host, Dan Leverington.
And I am your host, Rade Gutierrez.
And we are speaking to our first Green Fix guest to have appeared in front of a US Senate committee hearing in Washington, D.C., testifying how climate is already challenging US insurance markets like Florida. Rade Musulin is a principal at Finity Consulting with 45 years' experience in insurance, specialising in property pricing, natural perils, reinsurance, agriculture, catastrophe risk modelling, public policy development, and climate risk. Rade was named Co-Actuary of the Year by the Australian Actuaries Institute in 2023 for his work on climate risk and sustainability, including being the International Actuarial Association's representative at COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt, COP28 in Dubai, and the recent COP29 in Baku, Azerbaijan.
Today we will talk about how the Australian sustainability reporting standards are now mandated for the largest organisations across Australia, with companies in their supply chain also being requested for more detailed climate data ahead of their group's mandating timelines. A key feature of this reporting is climate scenario analysis in order for businesses to be prepared for future climate risks. Before we get into the ASRS, however, we're going to discuss the role that actuaries play within climate and take stock of how the evolving geopolitical landscape will impact Australian businesses. Rade, what are the skill sets that actuaries bring to the work of solving climate and sustainability challenges?
Well, then, climate and sustainability pose challenges that require multidisciplinary skill sets. And that includes scientists, economists, social scientists, public policy experts, and many more. We actuaries do many relevant things, which include, identifying and quantifying risk, developing metrics and measures of all kinds of things which are applicable in the climate space. We build financial models that can quantify damage and also the benefits of reducing that damage through adaptation. We compare investments today with benefits in the future. We price risk, and that could include things like the risk of a renewable power grid failing or a carbon project not performing. And we act as risk advisors to insurers and financial institutions that underwrite and finance energy projects. So I think these types of skills are important, and that's why there's increasing demand for our services and why our professional organizations like the International Actuarial Association are prioritizing upskilling actuaries.
That makes a lot of sense. On one of your previous webinars, you've said that past experience is not a good indicator of tail issues. How do you evaluate these tail issues and the risks that they present?
Well, when I said that, I was specifically referring to the tendency to take whatever data we have, say economic information from the last 30 years, and then trying to extrapolate tail risk by fitting distributions or applying creative statistical techniques. And while that's often valuable, it can miss tail events and create a false sense of security that we really understand things that maybe we don't. There's several ways to deal with that, including using scenario analysis to imagine things not in your data, or working out how events that occurred in the past might impact us today that aren't in your data set. So as an illustration of the last point, consider that Tohoku earthquake and tsunami that hit Japan several years ago. There hadn't been extreme tsunamis in that area in recent times, and so it really wasn't in our data sets. But if you go back in history, like around 1700, there was a huge tsunami that hit that exact area. Did anybody ask when they were building that nuclear power plant what might happen if that 1700 event were to occur today? Well, it did. and it caused a lot of grief in Japan. And so that just shows that we need to avoid the trap of thinking that because we are awash in oceans of data that, would have been unimaginable a few decades ago, that alone allows us to fully understand things like tail risk.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I think, of course, today, in speaking of climate disasters, we absolutely want to hear your perspective on the LA fires. And of course, we want to hear from the lens of a climate risk actuary. But first, as you are originally from Philadelphia and you have spent much of your professional career in Florida, in Asia, in Australia, we'd love to hear your thoughts on the new administration in the US and how does it factor into your climate risk modeling?
I've often said that one of the greatest climate risks we face is elections. And the U.S. is an example of that. Now, in saying that elections are a risk, I'm not passing judgment on specific policies of the new administration. But instead, I'm noting that in today's polarized world, a change of government often leads to policy whiplash. And we're certainly likely to see that coming out of the U.S. in the next few years. This is important, to firms planning their response to climate risk because they cannot just set a scenario based on the policies of whatever government's in power today and assume they'll remain in place for decades. So, firms need to be agile in their planning and allow for changes in direction, which can come from advances in technology, geopolitical events like wars in Ukraine or the Middle East, or elections. The problem that whipsaw policy changes pose is that investments to support our future energy infrastructure require thinking in decades, not the next election cycle. And thus, policy instability is expensive and it hurts everybody in the long run. And that's why we need to do everything we can to build policy consensus or at least narrow policy differences between political parties on climate risks so we get sustainable political policies that can lead to a sustainable environment.
Which is not necessarily a situation that we find ourselves in at the moment. In terms of the US presidential inauguration, it was held over the past week, including the first such speech to include Drill Baby Drill, as Trump announced a national energy emergency, quickly followed by an executive order to once again remove the US from the Paris Agreement in 12 months' time. How predictable was all of this?
Well, whatever else you think about President Trump, he's been incredibly successful in getting elected twice and putting himself in a position to enact his ideas. And he certainly hasn't been shy about saying what he was going to do. So this stuff should not have been any major surprise. I would note that there's some aspects of Trump's approach that are probably worth keeping in mind here. That he often makes announcements that are deliberately designed to antagonize people. He floods the zone with a dizzying amount of information, misinformation sometimes, and policy pronouncements. He often does not seem to think through the consequences of certain actions or the conflict between rhetoric and reality. And he tries to please a lot of disparate parts of his base. And one last thing, he's also a master of distraction. So he can sort of pivot from one thing to another. So if the climate stuff isn't going quite right, we got a border issue over here, or we've got a tariff over there. And again, that's part of the genius of his political ascent. So I don't need to be critical in that. I'm just observing stuff. So I think in climate, many of these traits are in evidence, and it may mean that his impact may be very different than what people think. And specifically on withdrawing from the Paris Accords, that's designed to infuriate environmentalists. But in reality, it may not have much practical impact. Remember, he did that last term too, and then the next administration restarted it. And actually, energy emissions and things in the U.S. actually did even decline when he pulled out of the agreement. So things I think are often a bit more complicated than they look. I will say, well, on Drill Baby Drill, this is a really fascinating issue because the U.S. is already producing record amounts of oil and gas, and it's unclear whether the fossil fuel interests that support President Trump actually want much more production. I mean, note that more production may lead to price declines and profit declines. We saw that with fracking in the Permian Basin and other things recently. And so we have a classic example here of contradictions in policy that maybe haven't been thought through. And other parts of his wind agenda may hurt people who support him. I mean, he doesn't like wind power. I think there was a problem with a golf course in Scotland and wind farms years ago. And, so he says he's going to try to kill wind power, but some of the states that are his biggest supporters are making huge amounts of money off wind power. I think Texas generates close to 30% of its energy from electricity from wind power. So Biden put a lot of the funding for green energy in Trump supporting congressional districts. So I'm not sure how all this, get rid of wind and drill and stuff is going to actually turn out when the rubber hits the road and you actually have to start implementing the rhetoric in policy.
Yes, absolutely. And it seems very much a part of the strategy to get as many executive orders out in the first few days to flood the zone, so to speak. So if there are some areas that you don't believe will be as big issues as some may think, what are some of the areas where you do see some concerns?
Well, to me, I kind of been counseling people, don't overreact to some of these early pronouncements because implementation is a lot more complicated than giving a speech and signing an order. But there are a couple of things I would urge people to keep in mind as they look at all this. One is that there are aspects of Project 2025, which is behind a lot of this stuff, that could be really troublesome. For example, one of the proposals in there is to disband the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, which is a scientific body that is coordinating collection of data, scientific information, and things like that. So if we were to stop collecting data, for example, or disband the scientific panels that are helping solve these problems, that could have really long-lasting consequences. There's also a move afoot to change the way the Environmental Protection Agency can, use its regulatory powers to declare greenhouse gas emissions pollution. If that goes through, it's going to have, again, very long-lasting impacts on future presidents' ability to use the regulatory system to regulate emissions. So to me, that sort of infrastructure stuff is, like scientists and satellites and data and regulatory infrastructure is probably the thing I'm more worried about than drill, baby, drill.
And we've talked a lot about the impacts on environmental policy, but what about the economy? So I'd love to hear your thoughts on what does the Trump presidency mean for the U.S. economy specifically?
I expect we're going to see a mixed bag of changes that are going to benefit certain sectors and harm others. And this is true of many changes in government and not necessarily a good or a bad thing. I mean, one thing is clear. President Trump is proposing many things like huge tariffs, which traditional economists have almost universally said hurt employment, prices, and the economy. We're going to see in a few years whether President Trump or the economists are right.
And it's been interesting because there's a few investment bankers who have come out in the past few days saying, well, if it's slightly inflationary versus it's better for national security, then, what's the big deal? So you're right. I think we will see that. In terms of that, the policy whiplash that you mentioned, what impact will such policy whiplash have on business strategy and investment decisions more broadly?
Well, this is actually the thing that I worry about most is businesses really struggle to deal with a lack of predictability. And again, that doesn't matter what the policy is, but changes in the policy can be really disruptive. And kind of going along with that is that what is often called crony capitalism, or situations where decisions are made not necessarily according to established rules, procedures, and laws, but instead based on the whims of people in power. Those things have generally led to bad economic outcomes, perhaps except for the cronies who are involved in it. But, again, we'll see what happens here. But you're kind of moving from a situation of very predictable rules and order to a disordered world with less rules, more whipsaw policy. And that's going to have some interesting consequences. I would note one other big risk that this all may cause for the U.S. is that it gets left behind in the clean energy revolution. I am sure America's economic competitors, notably China, are quite excited about the prospect of the U.S. pulling back on batteries, EVs, and renewable energy, because there's no doubt that other people in the world are going to jump into that vacuum and try to profit from it. Now, once again, maybe the future is diesel-powered cars and coal-fired power plants, but we'll see. But we're probably going to have a situation where if the U.S. pulls back from these things, it's probably going to be to the benefit of certain other countries.
I'm glad you bring up the global perspective, because I'd love to hear your thoughts on how this impacts trading partners to the U.S. and global economy. I mean, you've mentioned China already, but what other elements of change could we expect for the next few years?
The world is likely to be less interconnected and, in my view, probably less affluent as a result of some of the things that are being set in motion now. Australia is in a relatively good position. We've got good relations with the U.S., a key position in Asia, significant mineral and energy resources, and so forth. And actually, if there's a move to onshoring production, it actually may benefit us in the long run. China's well positioned to capitalize on an American retreat also. China's got the ability to plan long term and focus on the economy of the future, and I think that's going to help it in the long run. It is going to be interesting to see how all this affects certain climate initiatives. In Baku, there was, or just pick one random one, there was an interesting presentation from the African Development Bank about trying to build up the capacity to create solar energy infrastructure like solar panels in Africa, where you would keep the minerals there, you would employ Africans, you'd manufacture the infrastructure there, and then use it to create clean energy in places with lots of sunshine like the Sahel. Again, it is going to be interesting to see how some of the moves in the U.S. may impact some of those types of initiatives that are already established and in play all over the world.
Absolutely. And I feel like they've already had some experience over the past 50 years with multinationals coming in for natural resources. So there's probably some lessons learned there as well that they want to implement. Pivoting a bit more towards climate policy. So in your testimony to the Senate last June, you said the combination of demographics, development, and disasters poses a significant risk to our financial system, and climate change increases that risk. Addressing this will be a long-term effort which involves difficult policy choices. Thinking about the recent LA fires, what do you see as some of the non-climate related policy factors that contributed to this being the disaster that it has become?
The LA fires arose from a complex set of circumstances, which, as you said, climate change was only part of that. I mean, that included, excessive growth in high-risk areas, poor risk management, including too many homes virtually buried in vegetation in fire-prone areas, yet inadequate water resources to fight the fires, inadequate evacuation routes, and other civil planning things. Yet litigation that caused utilities due to past fires and them getting sued for starting them, they started cutting power when the winds went up, and that hampered pumping of water, which then led to water issues. You got a badly damaged insurance system there that has been through decades of regulatory changes and challenges. Some of that's been counterproductive and made the insurance system very brittle there. And then, of course, you had the climate-induced extreme rainfall followed by severe drought, which no doubt was enhanced by climate change. But if you look at LA, it's a combination of all this stuff that led to this situation, not just climate change in isolation.
And from your perspective, what were the failures in the system that prevent officials from acting on existing predictions at a systems level? In follow-up question, do you see similar failures here in Australia?
Well, I just noted some of the prior question, some of those system failures, but preventing calamities like this require very difficult actions which need to be sustained over many years. We need to future-proof communities against fire and other disasters, and that's going to involve uncomfortable political and economic decisions. Australia faces many of the same issues as California for fire risk, but fortunately here, I think there's some reasons we're in somewhat better shape. Our building codes have already begun to reflect climate risk. Our political leaders seem to understand the importance of improving resilience. Our population proportionally is not as embedded in the bush as the case is in the U.S. I mean, we certainly have people in the bush, but as a percentage of the population, it's probably not quite as much. We have a strong fire service, got a lot of experience managing fires. Our insurance system is certainly stronger. And hopefully we can learn from others' mistakes in places like LA, Florida, Hawaii, etc., and improve our response here.
In terms of those difficult and uncomfortable political and economic decisions that need to be made in order for that future-proofing for communities against future climate disasters, we are in an election year. What are some of those? What are some of those decisions going to have to look like?
Well, I think a lot of these things transcend individual elections, and as I said before, these things have to be thought about in decades, not years. I think fundamentally we need to change the way we think about building codes and land use policy to consider future conditions. If you're going to build something with a design life of 75 years, you better think about conditions over the next 75 years. Remarkably, building codes in the past didn't look at things that way. They looked at the conditions in the present and engineered for them. Australia has begun the journey to this by putting in a requirement to start in 2028, considering future climate risk in the building code. But the building stock rolls over slowly. And so changes made now to improve resilience are going to take decades to work their way through the whole housing system. And in the interim, we're going to have a lot of people in harm's way with buildings that are not fit for purpose. What are we going to do about that? Are we going to subsidize insurance? Are we going to relocate people? Are we going to take some other action to help our colleagues and community members to try to get through this transition when the climate may shift faster than the building stock? Dealing with that's going to be very expensive, and it's going to involve some painful disruption to communities. We could talk about Lismore or specific examples of that, but that's really hard to tell people they have to move out of their communities or uproot from where they've had generations of people living in these areas, or traditional owners of the land may be impacted and things. So this stuff's not easy, Dan, and it's going to take a lot of effort to try to deal with it.
Yeah, if you take the Palisades fire, for example, there are houses that are still standing there that were newer builds that have been built to newer codes. And so you have a real-time example of exactly what you're speaking about. There's some houses that have been there for 50, 60, 70 years that just didn't stand a chance because the building codes have changed so much. I'd love to now shift our conversation and our focus back to Australia and the commercial sector. Mandatory climate reporting is now in effect, with the first cohort having started their reporting as of the 1st of January. One of the key areas of these disclosures is the conducting of climate scenario analysis. While this is new territory for many companies, you have been running various forms of scenario analysis models for organizations in the public sector for over 40 years. In the broader sense, what is the benefit provided by running any type of scenario analysis?
Well, yes, I certainly have not been running climate scenario analyses for over 40 years, as almost no one was focused on that in the 1980s. But the broader idea of using scenario analysis to inform a range of analytical work or strategy planning has been around for a very long time. I mean, I started to think about this in terms of the effect of extreme disasters on insurance systems before we had catastrophe models. The technique's been used to inform economic policy, public policy, military planning, etc. So this is nothing new. But in climate risk, scenario analysis is used to assess potential impacts of climate-related risks on an entity's operations or strategies. And it involves considering, various hypothetical future scenarios or states to to understand how different climate-related factors, such as temperature rises, regulatory changes, market shifts, EVs, solar panels on roofs, could affect organization with a view towards making them more resilient to these changes by planning for them in advance of them happening.
What are the requirements that the Australian Sustainability Reporting Standard sets out for corporations to assess in climate scenario analysis?
Well, the ASRS requires at least two scenarios. One's a 1.5 degree scenario, which is largely in accordance with the Paris Accords, and one which well exceeds 2 degrees Celsius, which is not fully defined. Organizations have to disclose their physical and transition risks under each scenario. And so this involves identifying what those risks are and what the financial impacts arise from them. And that would include things like the impact on financial position, performance, cash flows, etc., over a short, medium, and long term. They also have to have a transition plan outlining how they're going to respond to risks and opportunities that have been identified. And that would include, changes in their business model or strategy to achieve climate-related targets and contribute to the transition. And importantly, this is not just about warmer temperatures, floods, or bushfires. It's also about the economic transition that would accompany decarbonization, which could involve EVs, different building practices, changes in supply chains for materials, and so on and so forth. And that type of effect is going to be different for each type of organization. There's no kind of one-size-fits-all scenario that you can put across all companies in the market.
And I think one thing that is quite clear to us as we talk to people in the industry is that there's a lot of immaturity in understanding what the climate scenario analysis is going to look like for their own organizations. There's a lot of immaturity in the practice, certainly to this level of scrutiny, as we're going to see now in the regulated space. It would be so helpful if you could walk us through the process of what does producing the assessment look like? Who is involved typically? What data needs to be gathered? And give us a sense of the resourcing that sustainability leaders are going to need to put into place in order to deliver on the climate risk assessment, very likely at the end of this year or middle of next year.
Well, it'll be phased in over several years, so smaller organizations won't have to begin doing this for a few years yet. But properly answering that question would take probably far more time than we have. But at a very high level, it begins with the board, senior management, and leadership of the organization to educate themselves on not only the letter of the law and the requirements that are in the standards, but also the economic changes that are likely to occur. What does a 1.5 degree world look like? What's going to happen with physical risk, etc. And it's often helpful as this first step to kind of start with a gap assessment, like, okay, where do we think we need to be in 3 years? Where are we now? And where are the gaps? And again, many organizations are well along the road on this, so that's going to differ wildly from one place to another. Then you need to agree on scenarios and then tailor them to your organization, and then identify, okay, if we're going to transition to EVs by 2050, or if we're going to, change the way we build buildings or whatever it is we're going to do differently to hit net zero. What does that mean for your organization? If you're an automobile repair network, what does it mean if you have to start servicing EVs instead of internal combustion cars? And then senior management has to identify risks and opportunities that are going to arise from all these changes. And it could even be things like workforce shortages. We may have shortages of electricians. And if you're an organization that needs a lot of electricians, then perhaps you might have to pay more for electricians or find a different way to, accomplish what you need to do as a business, et cetera. You're going to have to start thinking about emissions measurements, scope 1 and 2 to start, scope 3 down the road. You're going to need some kind of action plan to reduce emissions, or perhaps if you're not going to, explain why, though I think that'll be frowned upon. And all this needs to be integrated into the organization's broader risk management and strategic planning process, because this shouldn't exist in a silo. It should be part of business as usual in the organization. And while all that sounds like a huge amount of work, if businesses plan and invest the right way in the process, it doesn't need to be onerous. The key is starting early, taking it at pace, building it into your processes instead of creating a separate area over here disconnected from your business. And I know many companies are already well along this journey, but it is going to require work. It's not going to be a one-day seminar and a 2-page disclosure report. It's going to require a bit more work than that.
Just to put an even finer point on that, why are these climate scenario analyses in particular commercially critical to businesses to make sure they're incorporating them into their business strategy?
Actually, there's a very simple answer to that, and it's simply that you cannot understand the future in this area by extrapolating the past. It's not like you can take the last 30 years of data and project forward the next 5 when it comes to this stuff. It's all changing, and it's going to be very different. And this gets back to what I was talking about earlier, where we said, you can't just extrapolate the future from the past. And the other issue is you've got to consider a range of possibilities. We don't know what's going to happen in the future. The U.S. election is a perfect example of that. There are multiple future states that you could face, and that could be either due to technology, political change, global economic factors, a whole range of things. And so you've actually got to look at a range of future states and ask yourself, how resilient is your business to those things? And if it's not resilient enough, what are you going to do differently? And how are you going to take advantage of opportunities that may arise in this new economy so that your firm is successful?
And speaking about resilience in the context of talent, and you mentioned a couple of examples earlier around, the potential need for specific trades. This is one area that we're really passionate about, and it's the sustainability leaders having access to the right specialists to be effective in their own roles. I'd love to know what your opinion is on the current state of the talent pool for climate risk actuaries in Australia.
Well, there are a number of very well-trained actuaries in Australia in this space, as the Actuaries Institute has been a leader in the global profession on climate for a number of years now. And I've been privileged to have participated in that as chair of their climate committees and working groups. But the talent pool is still limited, as to date there hasn't been much formal education on climate in our traditional education process. And learning in this space takes a lot of time and effort. I was largely self-taught over 30 or 40 years in this space, working on academic projects, collaborating with scientists, building catastrophe models and things like that. But I know most folks don't have 30 years to figure this out. So we do need to kind of raise our game a bit on education. And the Institute is working hard to offer students and members educational opportunities. It's upgraded its climate sustainability working group to a full practice committee. And the International Actuarial Association, which I chair their climate sustainability committee, has really been working hard at this globally, including sending me to the last 3 COPs to represent the profession and learn what we can do to participate in this change to a clean energy world, and how we can help adaptation to extreme weather.
And it's fascinating because each person that we speak to within the climate and sustainability space, Rade, they each have their own unique journeys of how they got into the space, and no one was born with the with the requisite knowledge. In terms of your journey into becoming a climate risk actuary, what was it that attracted you to this field initially?
Well, I bet you everybody in my age group who is doing this work now, you could pretty much say that very few of them, if any, when they were 30 years old, thought they were going to be doing this. That'd be, in my case, back in the 1980s and 90s. To me, there were several attractions. I mean, first, and this is true for a lot of us, that this is one of the most important challenges of our time. And I really feel fortunate and honored that by a bit of luck and a bit of planning that I had the requisite training and experience to make a contribution late in my career to this. Second, the field is diverse. And in my case, I can use the wide background I've got in math and weather, extreme events, public policy, a lot of the experiences I've gained working around the world to help contribute to this, because a broad experience is really helpful. And this gives me a way to apply a lot of that experience I've gained over my career in a very important area. And finally, to me, this is an issue which energizes future generations of actuaries. And I hope to be, seen as somebody who kind of opened the door and helped future generations of actuaries get into this space, because I think we've got a huge role to play in this area in coming years.
I completely agree with that. Rade, it's been such a great conversation today. We are very grateful that you joined us. Before we wrap up the episode, we have 2 final questions. And these are the same questions we ask all of our guests. So I'll start with the first one. Right. If you had a magic wand and you could do anything you wanted with that magic wand, change one problem, change many problems, what would you like to do with that magic wand to change something in 5 years?
I'll answer that question without like wild pronouncements about just, making carbon pollution stop tomorrow or things that I think are probably completely unrealistic. I'll use my magic wand sparingly. Look, being an actuary who's kind of grounded in facts and logic, it would be nice if we could put the disinformation genie back in the bottle and get back to the way I remember things 3 or 4 decades ago, before the internet and social media. In those days, there was a generally shared view of facts and reality. Today, we've got way too many people making up reality, filling people's social media feeds with disinformation and alternative facts. And that just makes it almost impossible to have a cohesive society and tackle problems like climate risk. I like the quote from a U.S. Senator Patrick Moynihan, where he said, you're entitled to your own opinions, but not your own facts. And so my magic wand would just be a subtle thing in the background to just try to get us back to where we all are looking at the same set of facts, and then we can disagree about what to do about them. But at least if you got a common understanding of reality, there's a prayer you can start to solve problems and solve some of this policy whiplash, etc.
What a great use of a magic wand. Can you please take us out by telling us a piece of positive climate news that you've recently heard?
Well, again, I'll maybe answer this question a different way than your audience would expect me to. I've been to several COPs, and I've, before that, been around this process for quite a long time. And I actually found the one in Baku last year to be encouraging, though many others in the environmental movement disagreed. I see us moving away from unrealistic goals like holding warming to 1.5 degrees or getting rich countries to spend trillions of dollars to help developing countries. And instead, I see people kind of dealing more with reality and focusing on kind of finding practical solutions to problems we can actually do. Now, don't get me wrong. I wish we could hold warming to 1.5 degrees and get countries to properly fund things. Again, magic wand time, I would absolutely do that. But that's just not going to happen in the real world. And so the more we start to deal with reality, and that includes understanding why people who want to impede climate progress or progress of winning elections, the better our chances of actually getting things done. And so I've seen a growing movement of people trying to roll their sleeves up and actually get practical solutions to problems that can be implemented in the real world. I think that's a positive development. Now, again, we're going to have a lot of work to do to try to get those things implemented. But I think the first step in that is trying to communicate with the other side and trying to also say what's achievable and realistic to get done. And I'm seeing more and more of that. So that's probably a positive thing, but probably not the one you would have expected me to say.
No, that's fantastic. I appreciate your pragmatism. We've enjoyed today's call so much, and I think that's such a good note to end on in terms of the collaboration and the partnerships that may traditionally not have been there, but that are actually incredibly important if we are going to make the impacts that we want to. And really what we took away from today's conversation is the importance of companies not operating in a vacuum, not sticking their heads in the sand, ensuring that they have accurate climate scenario analyses and that they can use those for long-term decision-making today.
So thank you, Rade, and thanks to you for tuning in today. This was Green Fix with your hosts, Loretta Gutierrez and Dan Leverington. You can get your Green Fix every 2 weeks on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts.